I started to feel better and better as the summer went on. Played a lot. Was getting worn down, but I was ready to keep on going. I started, like I said, feeling more and more comfortable as the weeks went on, and felt great this week. Really didn't, make a whole lot or take advantage of it.
The golf world went absolutely nuclear in early 2024 when fans noticed something bizarre about Rickie Fowler's gear. His signature sponsors had vanished. No Farmers Insurance logos, no Rocket Mortgage branding, just blank space where millions of dollars in endorsements used to sit. Within hours, social media exploded with one question: was Rickie about to join LIV Golf? The timing couldn't have been more suspicious. And what happened next would reveal a story far more complicated than anyone expected. For years, Rickie Fowler represented everything golf wanted to be. The cool factor, the orange outfits that screamed confidence, the guy who made the sport feel young and exciting again, 6 PGA Tour victories, including that legendary 2015 Players' Championship where he absolutely dismantled the competition. He was supposed to be the next big thing, the marketable superstar who'd carry golf into a new generation. But somewhere between the hype and the reality, things started falling apart. The wins dried up, the consistency vanished. And by 2024, Rickie found himself in a position nobody predicted. Completely irrelevant. The sponsor situation sent shockwaves through the industry because it felt like the beginning of something bigger. When major brands pull their logos off a player's gear, it's usually a sign. Either the contract ended and nobody wanted to renew, or something else was brewing behind the scenes. Fans immediately connected the dots to LIV Golf, the Saudi-backed league that had been poaching PGA Tour stars with absolutely insane money. Rickie had flirted with LIV before. Everyone knew that. So when those sponsors disappeared, the conspiracy theories went wild. Message boards lit up. Twitter became a war zone of speculation. Golf journalists started making calls, trying to figure out what was really happening. But here's where the story gets interesting. This wasn't Rickie's first dance with LIV. Back in 2022, when the league first launched and started throwing around 9-figure contracts like party favors, Rickie admitted he'd been tempted. Actually tempted. He didn't hide it either. In interviews, he acknowledged that LIV had approached him, that the money was ridiculous, and that he'd seriously considered what it would mean for his career and his family. The PGA Tour was watching nervously because Rickie wasn't just any player. He was a brand, a cultural icon who still sold tickets even when he wasn't winning tournaments. Losing him to LIV would have been devastating for optics. The amount of money LIV was reportedly offering made people's heads spin. We're talking contracts that would have set up multiple generations of Fowlers. The kind of financial security that makes you question everything you thought you valued about loyalty and tradition. For a guy who'd been grinding on tour for over a decade, watching his game deteriorate, struggling to recapture the magic that once made him special, that kind of offer had to feel like a lifeline. But Rickie made a choice. He turned it down. He publicly declared his loyalty to the PGA Tour, said he had zero plans to go anywhere, and that he believed in the future of traditional golf. Fans applauded the decision, the PGA Tour breathed a sigh of relief, and everyone moved on, assuming the LIV chapter was closed forever. Except it wasn't. Not really. Because when those sponsors vanished in 2024, all those old questions came roaring back. Had Rickie changed his mind? Was he secretly negotiating? The timing felt too convenient to be coincidence. His game was in shambles, his ranking had plummeted, and suddenly the financial backing that kept him relevant was gone. It looked exactly like the setup for a LIV defection. Players who struggled on the PGA Tour often found new life and guaranteed money with LIV. Rickie fit the profile perfectly. A big name with fading results who could still draw attention and legitimize the rival league. The speculation became so intense that Rickie had to address it directly. His response was firm and almost annoyed. He told reporters he had zero interest in LIV Golf, zero plans to leave the PGA Tour. He emphasized his commitment to traditional golf and made it clear that the sponsor situation had nothing to do with some secret defection plan. The contracts had simply ended and negotiations for new deals were ongoing. It was business, not drama. But the damage was done. The golf world had already written the narrative in their heads, and even Rickie's denials couldn't fully kill the rumors. Because deep down, fans wondered if he was telling the whole truth or just buying time. What made the situation even more complicated was the brutal reality of Rickie's actual performance. The 2024 season was a disaster. Not just bad, career-threateningly awful. He played 22 events, and didn't record a single top 10 finish. Not one. His best result was a tie for 13th at the Sony Open, which sounds respectable until you realize that was literally the peak of his entire year. He finished 108th in the FedEx Cup standings, which for a player of his caliber felt like rock bottom. The stats painted a picture of someone who'd completely lost the plot. His driving accuracy was inconsistent, his putting, once a strength, had become a liability, and his mental game seemed shattered by the weight of expectations he could no longer meet. The golf media tried to be diplomatic, but the numbers didn't lie. Rickie was playing like someone who didn't belong on tour anymore. Tournament after tournament, he'd miss cuts or limp through weekends, posting scores that barely kept him above last place. It was painful to watch because everyone remembered what he used to be. The explosiveness, the creativity, the clutch performances that made highlight reels. All of that had evaporated, replaced by a version of Rickie who looked lost, frustrated, and frankly, defeated. Fans started asking the uncomfortable question: was his career basically over? Behind the scenes, things were even messier than the public knew. Rickie had been tinkering with his equipment setup constantly, which is usually a sign of desperation. He ended his relationship with tailor-made balls and gloves, switching to Titleist Pro V1S and testing different combinations, like a scientist trying to crack an impossible formula. He experimented with Cobra prototypes, adjusted his driver setup, and changed his wedge configurations. Every tournament seemed to feature some new tweak, some adjustment that was supposed to unlock the old magic, but nothing worked. The equipment changes became their own narrative, a subplot that reinforced how badly he was struggling. When elite players start swapping gear mid-season, it's rarely because things are going well. The family situation added another layer to the story that fans didn't fully appreciate. Rickie had gotten married to Alison Stocky, the former pole vaulter who'd become just as famous as he was. They'd started a family, welcoming their first daughter Maya in 2021 and their second daughter Nellie in August 2024. Suddenly, Rickie wasn't just a golfer grinding through tournaments. He was a father of two young kids, trying to balance the demands of professional sports with the chaos of early parenthood. Anyone who's been through it knows that combination is brutal. The sleepless nights, the constant travel, the emotional pull of wanting to be home instead of missing another family moment for a tournament you're probably going to miss the cut at anyway. Rickie started talking more openly about how fatherhood had changed him, how his priorities had shifted, how losses didn't sting the way they used to because he had something bigger waiting at home. It was sweet and mature and exactly the kind of thing that makes casual fans smile. But for hardcore golf observers, it also felt like a red flag. Champions don't talk about how losses don't hurt anymore. Champions stay hungry, borderline obsessed, willing to sacrifice everything for one more win. When a player starts philosophizing about perspective and family balance, it usually means the competitive fire is dimming, and Rickie's results suggested exactly that. The 2025 season started with a glimmer of hope, but quickly devolved into more of the same. He played the American Express in January and showed flashes of decent golf before fading on the weekend. Then came the WM Phoenix Open, one of his signature events where the crowds used to absolutely worship him. But this time, he had to withdraw due to illness. The tournament he'd once dominated, where fans screamed his name like he was a rock star, he couldn't even finish. The symbolism felt heavy. By the time spring rolled around, Rickie wasn't even qualified for the Masters, one of golf's most prestigious events. He was reduced to relying on sponsor exemptions just to get into tournaments, a humbling reality for someone who'd once been a lock for every major championship. The sponsor exemption situation became its own controversy. Tournament directors still wanted Rickie because he sold tickets and generated buzz, even if his game was trash. He had the kind of name recognition that moved merchandise and got casual fans to tune in. But other players started grumbling quietly. Why was Rickie getting these opportunities when younger, higher-ranked players were being passed over? The answer was obvious: marketability. Rickie Fowler playing badly was still worth more to a tournament's bottom line than some unknown kid playing well. But that didn't make it feel fair, and it highlighted just how much Rickie's career had transformed from competitor to spectacle. What really complicated the narrative was Rickie's appearance on Netflix's Full Swing documentary series. The show gave viewers an intimate look at his struggles, his family life, and his attempts to recapture form. He came across as likable, self-aware, and honest about how difficult things had become. But he also made comments that raised eyebrows. He talked about the grind being exhausting, about how travel wore him down, about missing his kids and wanting to be present for their childhood. It was relatable and human, but it also made people wonder if he was mentally checking out of competitive golf. Champions don't usually broadcast their fatigue. They hide it, push through it, and find ways to manufacture motivation even when it's gone. The equipment narrative continued throughout 2025, with Rickie making even more changes. He tested new Cobra drivers with different loft configurations. He experimented with shaft weights and ball compression ratings like he was building a science project. Puma, his apparel sponsor, kept releasing limited edition collections featuring his signature orange aesthetic, which sold well despite his terrible play. That disconnect between commercial success and competitive failure became the defining tension of his career. He was simultaneously irrelevant and essential, washed up and still bankable, finished and somehow still hanging around. The truth about the LIV situation eventually became clearer through industry sources. Rickie really hadn't been secretly negotiating with the Saudi League. The sponsor losses were exactly what he'd claimed, contracts expiring at unfortunate timing. But the rumors had served a purpose for LIV anyway. Even the speculation about Rickie joining had generated headlines and kept their league in the conversation. They didn't need him to actually sign. The possibility was enough. And for Rickie, the rumors were exhausting because they overshadowed any attempts to talk about his actual golf or his comeback plans. Every interview turned into defending his loyalty instead of discussing his game. By mid-2025, the golf world had largely written Rickie off. Not cruelly, but with a kind of sad acceptance. He'd become a nostalgia act, someone fans remembered fondly but didn't expect anything from anymore. His legacy was secure in a certain sense. 6 tour wins, memorable moments, and a cultural impact that extended beyond trophies. But there was also a lingering disappointment. He'd been positioned as the next American superstar, the guy who'd win majors and dominate for a decade. Instead, he'd flickered brilliantly for a few years before fading into mediocrity faster than anyone predicted. The what-ifs hung over every conversation about him. The business side of Rickie's career told a different story, though. Despite the terrible golf, he remained one of the sport's most valuable assets off the course. Puma kept him as a featured athlete. Cobra still built prototype clubs for him. He had social media reach that rivaled players ranked 50 spots higher. Tournament directors still begged for his presence. In the modern sports landscape, relevance doesn't always correlate with performance. Rickie had mastered the art of staying visible, staying likable, and staying profitable even when his competitive output had completely collapsed. That's a skill in itself, even if purists hated admitting it. The Ryder Cup conversation around Rickie became almost comical. He'd been a staple of American teams in the past, delivering clutch performances and providing veteran leadership. But by 2025, nobody seriously considered him for the actual playing roster. His ranking was too low, his form was too inconsistent. Instead, whispers started about him becoming a vice captain, a ceremonial role for beloved players who couldn't contribute competitively anymore. Rickie hadn't even turned 40 yet, and people were already talking about him in past tense. The speed of his decline was shocking because it didn't come from injury or scandal. It came from something more mysterious, the gradual erosion of whatever made him special in the first place. Some analysts tried to pinpoint exactly when things went wrong. Was it the pressure of expectations that he could never quite fulfill? The mental burden of being hyped as the next big thing without ever winning a major? The physical toll of a decade-plus grinding on tour? Or simply the reality that his peak was always going to be shorter than people hoped? There's no single answer, but the combination of factors created a perfect storm. Rickie had been good enough to taste greatness, but not quite good enough to sustain it. And once the wins stopped coming, confidence evaporated. Golf is brutally mental, and watching yourself decline in real time has to be psychologically devastating. The comparison to other players made Rickie's situation even more stark. Guys like Scottie Scheffler and Xander Schauffele were dominating in their primes, racking up wins and major championships. Meanwhile, Rickie was fighting just to make cuts and qualify for events. The gap between him and the elite had become a chasm. Even players from his own generation like Jordan Spieth, despite their own struggles, still managed to show flashes of brilliance and stay relevant in the world rankings. Rickie had fallen further faster than any of his peers, which made people wonder if there was something specific to his game or mentality that accelerated the collapse. His social media presence remained oddly upbeat throughout the struggles. Rickie posted photos with his family, shared moments from practice sessions, and maintained the same friendly, accessible persona that made him popular in the first place. But fans started reading between the lines. the forced positivity, the generic motivational captions, the absence of any real fire or competitive hunger. It felt like someone going through the motions, maintaining appearances, but not actually believing in a comeback anymore. Maybe he'd made peace with where his career was heading. Maybe fatherhood really had changed his priorities to the point where competitive golf didn't matter as much. Or maybe he was just protecting himself emotionally from admitting how far he'd fallen. The financial reality of his situation was probably more secure than people realized. Even with the sponsor losses, Rickie had earned over $40 million in prize money during his career, plus tens of millions more in endorsements. He owned real estate. He had investments. His wife Allison had her own career and earning power. They weren't hurting for money, which meant Rickie didn't have the same desperation that drives some players to keep grinding long after their skills have diminished. He could theoretically walk away tomorrow and live comfortably forever. That security might have been part of the problem. When you don't need golf to survive, maintaining the intensity required to compete at the highest level becomes much harder. The equipment companies didn't abandon him despite his struggles, which said something about his lasting value. Cobra knew that Rickie testing their clubs still generated interest and publicity. Titleist was happy to have him playing their golf balls even if he wasn't winning with them. Puma kept designing apparel around his aesthetic because the product sold regardless of his tournament results. In a weird way, Rickie had transcended performance-based endorsements and moved into pure brand territory. He was famous for being famous at this point, a golf celebrity whose actual golf had become almost secondary to his image. The question everyone kept asking was whether a comeback was even possible. Could Rickie find whatever he'd lost and recapture even a fraction of his former ability? History suggested it was unlikely. Very few players who decline this dramatically ever fully recover. The physical skills might still be there, but the mental component of golf is unforgiving. Once doubt creeps in, once muscle memory gets corrupted by overthinking, once pressure becomes suffocating instead of motivating, the way back becomes nearly impossible. Rickie would need to basically reprogram his entire approach to the game, find new motivation, and somehow block out all the noise about his failures. That's asking a lot from someone who'd been beaten down by 3 years of terrible results. The 2025 season continued with more of the same mediocrity. Occasional decent rounds followed by collapses, moments of brilliance immediately neutralized by stretches of absolute incompetence. Rickie wasn't improving, but he also wasn't retiring. He existed in this strange purgatory, still playing, still getting invited to tournaments, still collecting appearance fees and sponsor money, but not actually competing for anything meaningful. It was the prolonged ending that nobody wanted but everyone saw coming. The gradual fade rather than the dramatic exit. Tournament broadcasts still loved cutting to shots of Rickie in the gallery or showing brief highlights of his rounds, even when he was 10 strokes off the lead and playing for absolutely nothing. The networks understood that casual fans still recognized his face and his orange outfits. He was content, filler material to break up the monotony of watching actual contenders. That had to sting for someone who'd once been the main attraction, the player everyone tuned in to watch. Now he was background noise, a reminder of past relevance in a sport that had moved on without him. The golf media tried to be respectful in their coverage, but the subtext was always there. Articles would praise his career accomplishments while using past tense language that made it clear they considered him finished. Podcasts would discuss his legacy as if he'd already retired. Analysts would mention him only in retrospective contexts, comparing current young players to peak Rickie as a measuring stick. Nobody was outright cruel, but the collective message was unmistakable. Rickie Fowler's time as a relevant competitive golfer was over. What remained was just the cleanup phase, however long he chose to drag it out. His relationship with fans stayed positive, which was probably the one bright spot in all of this. People didn't turn on Rickie the way they sometimes do with fallen athletes. He'd always been too likable, too humble, too willing to engage with supporters for anyone to truly root against him. Fans felt sad about his decline rather than angry or betrayed. They'd wanted him to succeed, hoped for the big comeback, and when it never materialized, they just felt disappointed for him rather than at him. That goodwill was his most valuable asset, the thing that would carry him into whatever came next, whether that was media work, course design, coaching, or just comfortable retirement. The speculation about his future became a cottage industry. Would he transition to broadcasting? His personality seemed perfect for a commentary role. Would he focus on business ventures, leveraging his name recognition into golf-related companies? Would he simply fade away quietly, prioritizing family and leaving the sport behind without fanfare? Every option seemed plausible because Rickie had proven he could monetize his brand without needing to win tournaments. The traditional athletic career arc didn't really apply to him anymore. He'd found a way to remain valuable in spite of competitive failure, which was either genius or depressing depending on your perspective. Looking back at everything that happened between the LIV rumors, the sponsor losses, the family priorities, and the brutal performance statistics, one thing became clear. Rickie Fowler's career would be remembered as one of golf's great what-ifs. What if he'd won a major championship? What if he'd sustained his peak for longer? What if the pressure hadn't crushed him? What if he'd joined LIV for the guaranteed money? What if fatherhood hadn't shifted his priorities? What if the equipment changes had actually worked? What if he'd been born in a different era with less competition? The questions multiplied endlessly because there was no satisfying answer to why someone with so much talent and potential had flamed out so completely. The 2025 season would likely continue with more sponsor exemptions, more mid-pack finishes, and more quiet acceptance that competitive Rickie was gone. Maybe he'd surprise everyone with one last magical week, one final Sunday where everything clicked and he reminded the world why people believed in him in the first place. Golf loves comeback stories, and fans would absolutely embrace that narrative if it happened. But the odds were against it. The window was closing, and Rickie seemed more focused on being a good father than a great golfer, which was probably the healthiest choice even if it disappointed those who wanted one more chapter of glory. The story of Rickie Fowler in 2024 and 2025 wasn't about LIV Golf or sponsor drama or any single dramatic moment. It was about the slow, painful reality of watching someone realize they're not who they used to be and struggling to figure out what comes next. It was about a likable guy who'd been built up as the future of American golf, failing to deliver on that promise and having to live with the aftermath. It was about the complicated intersection of family, finances, fame, and fading ability. And it was ultimately about acceptance. Accepting that some careers peak early and decline fast. Accepting that not every talented player becomes a legend. Accepting that sometimes, despite all the hype and hope and effort, things just don't work out the way everyone planned. That's the real story. Not shocking, not scandalous, just honest, human, and a little bit heartbreaking.